Welcome to part 4 of Death and Hell, What Does the Bible Say? The prominent atheist Richard Dawkins once said that faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is the belief in spite of, or perhaps because of, the lack of evidence. I take issue with a couple of things he says here. First of all, that faith is a great excuse to evade the need to think. I am a thinking facilitator. That's part of what I try to be doing through this course, is getting you to think about things, think through things. I believe that God created our minds to have great capacity to think and even to reason, which is not an enemy of faith. It is, in fact, very much a part of a sound faith. The other thing I take issue with is what he says about evidence, that faith is belief in spite of evidence, or perhaps even because of a lack of evidence. Now, I will say that this is true for some people, that some people have a blind faith, a faith that is not built on evidence. And that isn't good. That is not a faith that is likely to be very strong or very sound. Evidence-based beliefs are less likely to be shaken and more likely to be true. Faith doesn't have to be, nor should it be, a lack of evidence, but a sound faith, sound belief is built on evidence. You weigh the evidence, you see what particular beliefs seem to have the weight of evidence behind them, and that's the direction in which you go if you are a truth seeker. That's what I aim to be. That's what I urge you to be as well. Someone who wants to know the truth about everything, about God and about these matters of death and hell. Last time in part 3, I talked about what life and death are according to the Bible. It gives us a formula for life, body plus spirit. It gives us a formula for death, body minus spirit. It shows that when body and spirit are combined, they form a soul, which is simply a word meaning a living person. Last time we saw how the Bible talks about two different deaths, the first death and the second death. These terms are not always used. In fact, the first death is not a term that's used, but it's a concept that we see. That's what happened when Adam was 930 years old. He died the first death. The second death is a concept that I touched on, but we'll deal with a lot more in later sessions. I talked about why there's death at all, especially the first death, that when we deal with why questions, we have to look at the cause and the purpose. There are two different ways we can mean why. The cause of the first death is a separation from the source of life, and the purpose of the first death was a mercy that God provided so that Adam and Eve and all the rest of us wouldn't have to live day after day endlessly with the pain and suffering that we have in this life. That would be absolutely unbearable. This time in part 4, we will look at what happens after death, what we can see from the Bible that people believed was true about that, what Jesus believed was true, and what we can tell from the account of the death of Jesus, what happened after he died. Before we get into all of that, just to remind us of these two competing schools of thought. The devil's paradigm says that what matters is where you end up, hell or heaven. People often think in these terms that you either go to heaven or go to hell when you die, that you'll spend eternity in either heaven or hell, that it's all about location. But the Bible gives us a different paradigm, the dichotomy of life and death. It says that what matters isn't where you end up, but how you end up, dead or alive. What happens after death? What does the Bible say about that? I'm going to share with you several passages that are representative of even more passages that say the same sort of thing. But just to give you a sampling here. 1 Kings 2, David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. 2 Kings 10. Jehu slept with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria. Psalm 6. In death there is no remembrance of you, God. In Sheol, who will give you thanks? You might remember from a previous session we saw this word Sheol. It's a Hebrew word that sometimes does not get translated into English. When it is, it's typically translated as grave or pit or hell. O Lord, my God, brighten my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Psalm 30. O Lord, you have brought up my soul from the grave. You have kept me alive, that I should not go down to the pit. Further on in that chapter, what profit is there in my death if I go down to the pit? Will the dust give you thanks? Will it declare your truth? Psalm 31. Do not let me be ashamed, O Lord, for I have called on you. Let the wicked be ashamed, and let them be silent in the grave. Psalm 115. The dead do not praise the Lord, nor do any who go down into silence. Psalm 146. His breath leaves him, and he returns to the earth. On that very day, his plans perish. Ecclesiastes 9. The living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. What they loved, hated, and envied has already perished. Daniel 12. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, but others to shame and everlasting contempt. Notice in this one, it talks about death, and then it talks about resurrection. There's a present tense, sleep in the dust of the earth, and then it shifts to a future tense, shall awake. It doesn't say many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth are awake. It says they will awake, future tense. 1 Corinthians 15. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. Ephesians 5. Awake, you who sleep. Arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. 1 Thessalonians. I would not have you ignorant, brothers, concerning those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who are asleep. Did you notice that theme from Old Testament to New Testament? There's a metaphor that the Bible gives us for death, the metaphor of sleep. And when we are asleep, we are not conscious. We are not aware of what is going on around us. We have no consciousness of reality. When we're asleep, the dog might get up and move to the other side of the room. The temperature in the room might change. A car might go by outside. We don't feel or hear or see. We don't sense in any way any of this. When we're asleep, there is no consciousness, there's no awareness of reality. The Bible uses sleep as a metaphor for death for a reason. There is this similarity of when we're asleep, we don't know what's going on. The next thing we know, it's morning. 5 minutes might have gone past, 8 hours might have gone past, 1,000 years could go by, and we're not aware of any of it. The next thing we know, we are awake again. The Bible tells us that the dead know nothing. There's nothing going on in their brains. They have no awareness or consciousness. They know nothing. They're not making plans. They're not praising God. They're not thanking God. If it were true that we go to heaven when we die, certainly we would be praising God, thanking God. We would be knowing things, making plans. But the Bible refers to death very differently, that there's silence and nothingness. It's like sleep. There's a mercy in this, as within all things that God does. There's not a consciousness that entails watching the pain and suffering of our loved ones. There's not any pain and suffering of our own if we die and go to hell. If hell is a place of torment and fire without end. So it's really good news that death does not entail any experience of suffering of any kind, either through direct experience, something happening to us, or observing or knowing about something happening to someone else. It's just like being asleep. And the next thing we know, it's morning and we're awake again. That waking up is resurrection, which we'll deal with in another session. But right now, just notice how the Bible uses sleep as a metaphor for death throughout Old Testament, New Testament. In an earlier session, when I went through the history of this notion that when we die, we don't really die, the doctrine of soul immortality that came into Christianity from Greek philosophy, that notion was not mainstream among God's people at all until 3rd or 4th century. So certainly in the Bible times, that's not what God's people believed about death. They didn't believe that when we die, we just go on living in some other place or some other form. Let's look at some of the passages that help us know that. This is a passage that is found in Jeremiah 31, and then it is quoted in the New Testament in Matthew 2. In Ramah, a voice was heard, grieving and weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she would not be comforted because they are no more. Some translations say, because they are not. There's no notion here that Rachel's children were in a better place. They were in heaven, but they were no more. They were not. They were sleeping, awaiting a resurrection. In John 11, we have the account of the death of Lazarus, who was a friend of Jesus. Lazarus had 2 sisters, Mary and Martha. Martha is grieving the loss of her brother, and Jesus tells her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." This is a moment where, in the midst of the grief of loss, they are both looking at the promise, the hope they are given. That promise and that hope, that encouragement, they don't find that by saying, "Your brother is in a better place. Yes, Lord, I know that he's in heaven." But rather, Jesus says, "Your brother will rise again." And she says, "Yes, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." The last day is a reference to the second coming of Jesus. Let's look a little more at what Jesus believed and taught about death. In that same account in John 11 about the death of Lazarus, Jesus was talking to his disciples. He said, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going that I may awaken him from sleep." Then his disciples said, "Lord, if he is sleeping, he will be well." Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he was speaking of getting rest through sleep. So then Jesus plainly told them, "Lazarus is dead." Here's this sleep metaphor again. Death is a sleep that only God, the life giver, can awaken us from. In fact, it is in this account where Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life." when someone sleeps the sleep of death, the awakening, the resurrection comes from God alone, because God is life. Let's look at a particular death in the Bible that we have a little more information about than others, the death of Jesus. Here it is as it's recorded in Luke 23. One of the criminals who were hanged said to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." This passage, in every English translation of the Bible I've looked at, is punctuated like this. Truly, comma, I tell you, comma, today you will be with me in paradise. When it is punctuated this way, it means that the criminal and Jesus would be in paradise the day Jesus said this, the day Jesus died. Here's the thing. In the Greek manuscripts, punctuation isn't used. Any punctuation we see has been added by the translators. This punctuation is not in the original manuscripts of the Bible. Translators punctuated it and therefore provided it a particular meaning. Punctuation can affect the meaning of a sentence. Here's an example. Let's say you're driving along in Africa and you see this sign on the side of the road. "Elephants, please stay in your car." Well, I didn't even know they could drive. That's how I might respond if it were punctuated like this. "Elephants, comma, please stay in your car." The sign would be addressing the elephants, telling the elephants to stay in their car. But what if it were punctuated this way? "Elephants, please stay in your car." Well, then I would know that there were elephants in the area and I should stay in my car. Punctuation affects meaning. You change the punctuation of a sentence, you could very well change its meaning. How do we know then if the original Greek doesn't have punctuation? How do we know how it should be punctuated and therefore understood? Let's look at the different ways it could be punctuated. We have the way that it is punctuated in the English translations. "Truly, comma, I tell you, comma, today you will be with me in paradise." What if it were punctuated this way? "Truly, comma, I tell you today, comma, you will be with me in paradise." That changes the meaning of the sentence quite dramatically. When you punctuate it this way, it means that Jesus is telling him something today. And that something is that he will be with him in paradise at some point in the future. How do we know which is the correct way to translate it and therefore understand? If we go a little further in time after Jesus said this, a couple of days later, as recorded in John 20, after Jesus rises from the dead, Sunday morning, he said to Mary, "Stop holding on to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father." Jesus did not go to paradise, to heaven, on Friday when he was talking to the criminal next to him. Now, some might say, well, paradise is someplace other than where the Father is. They went to some other place called paradise that is not heaven that day. But there's no indication that there is some other place where people go when they die called paradise in the Bible. When that word paradise is used, it's clear from the context it's referring to heaven, where God is. So, since Jesus did not go to heaven the day he died, the correct way to punctuate this sentence is "Truly, comma, I tell you today, comma, you will be with me in paradise." I've heard some say, well, that sentence structure doesn't really make sense. We don't talk like that. "I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise." But we do sometimes. In fact, there are other times in the Bible when that sort of sentence structure was recorded. Back in Deuteronomy 30, We've already spent some time in Deuteronomy 30. This is some of the last things that Moses is telling the people before he dies. He said, I declare to you today that you will surely perish. He's not telling them that they will perish that day. He's telling them that day that sometime in the future they will surely perish. We talk this way even now. I'm telling you right now, Gene Wilder is the real Willy Wonka. This is a way people talk, and apparently have talked for millennia. It's a way of emphasizing something. Jesus wanted to emphasize what he was telling the criminal who was dying right next to him, that promise that one day they would be together in heaven. So we're seeing, as we dig deeper and deeper here, more evidence that this mainstream Christian belief about what happens when we die, that when we die, we don't really die, we continue living on in some other place, in some other form, that we are or we have immortal souls, that notion does not come from the Bible. We see that the more we look at the Bible, and we see that in the historical record, that it comes from the devil by way of pagan religion and philosophy. All right, so in part 4, I talked about what happens after death according to the Bible. We see that the people who lived in Bible times, including Jesus, had no notion that after we die, we go to heaven, or we have experiences that we can report about. Lazarus didn't come back sharing a report of what he had done when he was dead. That death is like the most deep sleep that one day we will awaken from. Next time in part 5, I will talk about ghosts. What are ghosts? Are they real? What does the Bible say? I'll see you next time.